Hello, everyone. Hello, devs and disruptors. Today, I am here to talk to you about latency. So, the average voice AI response times usually sit about an industry average of 3,000 milliseconds. But how can we get that down to the human average of about 250 milliseconds? That is a big discrepancy. And more importantly, do we really need to? So I'm going to dive into where latency matters from a fundamental human psychology perspective and where it doesn't when we're talking about voice AI. So we'll start with a stark reality. Right now, the average voice bot has a latency of up to 3 seconds. That's 3 full regular seconds. In human conversation terms, that is an eternity. And the reason for that is because when you stop talking to a voice bot, it waits 500 to 800 milliseconds just to make sure that you're done talking. It then processes your speech to text. The text goes to an LLM for processing, the response is generated, and then finally text-to-speech conversion begins, and only then do you hear the very first sound of that AI replying to you. And each step seems reasonable in isolation. It ranges from 200 to 400 milliseconds. But when you add that up, it creates an experience that violates every instinct that we have about human conversations. We'll see if the clicker works. Okay, the clicker doesn't work. That's okay. There we go. So research from the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics shows that our human brains are hardwired to expect responses within 200 to 300 milliseconds. And that's not something that's just a preference, it's neurologically encoded. So when responses take any longer than about 600 milliseconds, our amygdala starts firing, signaling that something might be wrong. By the time we get 1,000 milliseconds of space, we're already starting to formulate theories like, oh, maybe they didn't hear me. Did I mumble? Are they confused? Are they ignoring me? Did I say something dumb? And we start to panic. So in order to speed up voice AI, we need to understand how humans actually converse. And it's both nothing like and exactly the same as the request-response model that we're used to building with computers. So human conversation is more like the gigabit reception jam session than it is like classical music. So we're not waiting for complete silences to jump in. We're anticipating, we're overlapping, we're harmonizing. Some research from Stephen Levinson shows that we have a few core mechanisms that help us be quick, thinking on our feet. So we've got prosodic cues, which is just a fancy way for saying we're listening to your pitch, your volume, your speaking rate, and all of these things are subconscious. We're just picking up on things like when someone says, would you like coffee? Or we are going to assume they're going to say tea. We've also got syntactic completion points. So that's just another fancy way for saying we're guessing what the next part of the sentence is going to be based on the grammar. So if the sentence says, the weather today is really blank, it's kind of like playing the Wordle every day. There's only a few words that could possibly fit in the end of that sentence. The weather today is really nice, is really terrible, is unpredictable, things like that. And then finally, we have semantic closure and nonverbal signals. So we can recognize when someone is done talking, when their meaning is complete, even if they're mid-sentence. So this is why usually, not always, we've all been here, but usually we can interrupt somebody appropriately. So we can understand their intent before their words are even fully spoken. So we call this the 200 millisecond miracle. All of those little tips and tricks give us this really special ability that computers don't have when it comes to latency in conversations. So we actually need about 600 to 800 milliseconds to plan what we're going to say. And there's tons of research on this. Sometimes it's even more than that, depending on how complicated the question is or whether or not we're familiar with the person we're talking to. But despite all this planning time that we need, humans are consistently achieving about 200 to 300 millisecond gaps between turns. So how is this possible? So just like computers, speakers always need to process a partner's utterance, decide what to say, and then reply. So it's very unlikely for a full turn, if we're looking at everything that's happening behind the scenes, to be less than a second long, even if all we're saying is yeah or sure. So a full turn is about, on average, 800 to 200 milliseconds long, assuming that response gaps are 200 milliseconds. It's a lot of numbers, but pretty much it takes us a while to think about what we're going to say. The better we know the person we're talking to, our speaking partner, the more likely we are to overlap speech, because in less formal settings, it's not considered rude, and you're more likely to know what the other person is going to say. Lab studies, which a lot of this data is from, are obviously a lot more formal. So we're looking at data for conversations that follow more of a formal script, which translates perfectly to voice AI because almost never are people calling just to chit-chat. And, you know, even then, sometimes people do. We have a lot of voice AI. People like to chit-chat. But most business use cases we're looking at are things like Lily was talking about, like IVRs, phone menus, things like that. Depending on what we're looking at, the average time to plan can be about 600 to 800 milliseconds. For example, naming what a picture of a line drawing is. Or preparing a simple sentence can take about a second or more. So the way that we put together all of our little tips and tricks that I told you about earlier is called parallel planning. So turns don't happen in a perfect sequence like they do with computers. People do not first listen to the entire speaker's turn and then begin what to say, right? Listening and response planning are happening at exactly the same time. They overlap. So comprehension and production systems work in parallel. The speaker's planning what they're going to say before the end of their partner's turn. So for example, if I'm a barista and I say, "What can I?" You're already planning on ordering your oat milk latte before I even say, "Get you today." This results in those really short gaps between utterances because listeners are able to take risks. That's the big takeaway here. The risk there being, what am I going to say next? What are you going to say next? And when to start speaking based on when I think you're going to be finished talking. In fact, research shows that it's only possible to have those 200 millisecond gaps if participants are parallel planning. So it's not only a fun perk, it's necessary in conversation. And even if you think you're not doing that ADHD thing where you're planning what you're going to say, the back of your brain is, no matter what you do. So I know some of us try really hard to actively listen, but the back of your brain, no matter what you do, is always planning the next thing to say. Another study, for example, gave participants quiz questions with early cues versus late cues. So for example, an early cue would be, which character, also called 007, appeared in the famous movies, versus which character from the famous movies is also called 007. Participants responded 300 milliseconds faster with those early cues, proving that we start planning our responses the moment we grasp the gist of what the person is going to say, not when the person finishes speaking. So that's another big difference between us and computers. Naturally, the harder it is to think of a response, the longer those gap times are going to be, just because you run out of time to plan your next utterance. In these same quiz studies, the average utterance latency was about 600 to 750 milliseconds. So that's double the average conversation time that we were talking about earlier. So when we're with our good friends, we're hanging out at ClueCon, it's about 200 to 300 milliseconds. Like, hey, how are you doing? I'm doing good. But in a setting where you're asking somebody a quiz question, asking them directions, asking them, what's your talk going to be about? We're looking at doubling that time to about 750 milliseconds, which is really good news for us when we're building AI use cases. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit so I don't run out of time. Okay, so traditional voice bots process sequentially, unlike us humans. So we all know it listens, then it understands, then it quote-unquote thinks, and then it responds. And we know that us humans, we process in parallel. So it's listen and also predict and also prepare and then respond. So AI voice systems face a very unique challenge. They have to detect when a human has finished speaking using only audio cues. So they don't have the benefit of listening to your cadence, analyzing your grammar, looking at your face, things like that. AI bots measure the silence from its partner to know when to start speaking. We could hypothetically create, something where the AI bot takes a look at your grammar and it guesses based on the grammar, but that's just adding more legs to the journey, and that's just adding more latency. So it might be more accurate, but you're sacrificing accuracy for speed, which we're going to talk about could become very important when we're designing AI. So before we dive into how to engineer low latency AI, we have to talk about how I personally am measuring and defining each leg of the audio journey. This is how we do it at SignalWire. If you build bots with our AI backend, these are the numbers that you're going to see. I think LiveKit has very similar measurements. I think probably all of you are measuring similar things as well. So the magical number that I'm mostly comparing to today is called audio response latency. So that's the time from when a user finishes speech and audio playback begins. So how long it's been until you actually hear the AI's voice response. That is the magical number because that's the silence that we feel. That's the measurement of silence. The utterance response latency is going to be the time from a user finishing speech to when the AI has a complete response ready. So how long until the AI has figured out an actual sentence, an actual full answer? Versus LLM latency is just the time from when a user finishes their speech to when the first AI token is received. So how quickly does the AI start generating responses after it detected you've stopped talking? For example, if I ask Sigmund, hey, how are you doing? And Sigmund says, I'm doing fine, how are you? That first I that it receives is the LLM latency. And then I'm doing fine is considered the first utterance. And that's important because all of those things add up and impact how long it takes before we start hearing something, which impacts that magical number of audio latency. So just a reminder, human quote-unquote audio latency is about 200 to 300 milliseconds in a casual conversation, up to 800 milliseconds in a more formal setting. So, of course, adding in speech-to-text and text-to-speech processing adds time to the overall turnaround time of our utterances. So how can we engineer AI to be faster? Introducing transparent barge. So I mentioned that the AI can't process your language until it knows that you're done talking, right? So a fun trick we can do is instead of waiting for a long enough silence, so waiting 800 milliseconds of nothing, we are continuously streaming audio to our processing pipeline. So every 250 milliseconds, we are accumulating the audio, sending it to the text-to-speech, and then the LLM begins processing on those transcripts. And then it generates a potential response. But Abby, what if I wasn't done talking? 250 milliseconds is not that long. People stop to say to think. Well, that's simple. We just throw it away. We discard the prepared response, and then we glue together our new accumulated audio input and regenerate a new response. So, hey, how are you doing? If I wasn't done talking, if I was going to say, hey, how are you doing? I've got a question for you, Sigmund. We throw away our prepared response. We glue together, hey, how are you doing? I have a question for you, Sigmund. And now we generate a brand new, net new response from those two phrases glued together. And something I think is really cool is that this mimics that risk-taking concept that I highlighted earlier when we're talking about human conversations. People, when we're talking, it's really normal to start a response prematurely, aka accidentally cut somebody off. Maybe you think you know what the person's going to say, and it turns out you were very wrong. That almost never happens to me, but I'm sure it happens to some of you. So studies actually show, people do a ton of research on this. We interrupt accurately, like appropriately, only about 72% of the time. But that imperfection, at least in my opinion, actually makes the conversation feel more natural. It's something that we expect, right? Another thing that we can do besides transparent bars to kind of speed up the feeling of the AI is using filler strategies. So I know when I've been up here, I've been saying, upcoming next, I'm going to switch my slide. It buys me processing time, aka humans stall. And AI can stall as well. If I can do it, why can't Sigmund, right? The cool thing is AI can actually stall smartly, intelligently, as opposed to saying things like, unless you design it to be that way. Of course, we're all a room of engineers. You can make it do whatever you want. But for things like complex queries, like maybe you're asking it to go fetch the weather, like the data of what the weather is in Chicago, you can say things like, I am checking the weather in Chicago for you right now to buy you time while your program goes and actually fetches that data. You can say things like, oh, let me analyze that for you. Meanwhile, you're calling another API. So if humans can do it, AI can do it too. We're really just talking about the way the latency feels. Normal people who are calling into your applications aren't counting like we are. At least I do. I feel like a lot of you probably are vigilant about that as well. I want to know the exact number of how long it took to process the language. I want to know how long it took to retrieve the data. But normal people just want to know whether or not they're sitting awkwardly on the phone or whether they're not. The last thing that we can do to speed up AI is just for it to start talking right away when it gets to that first utterance. So that first phrase of, how are you doing? I'm doing fine. Because it's actually, the text-to-speech is slower than the processing of the LLM. So that buys us precious seconds. If you start talking before the language is processed, your prompt is you're fully printed, it buys you extra time. So if you start talking, if you have your bot start talking the second it has something to say, you have more time to think of more things to say. I was going to show you some comparisons of different latencies, but I'm at 6 minutes and I have more things to say. But just like a little highlight, I recorded some conversations with different AIs and different humans, and I measured the latencies. This is the audio latency, so this is the silence that we're feeling. And I just went into Audacity and did it manually, right? So I just highlighted the section of silence and looked at how many milliseconds it was. So I talked to Sharon White, who you guys might have met yesterday, and I asked her, how many times have you been to ClueCon? And she said, I would probably say 15 times. And the measurement of that was 3.329 seconds, if you don't count the which I'm not counting, because she said for quite a while. Sorry, I'm blowing out the mic with my laughter. I asked her, have you been to Chicago more than that? She said, yeah. Many times. That was 1.115 seconds. Like I said, the more complicated the question, the longer it takes. For example, Sigmund is a very consistent 2.229 seconds. I asked him the same exact questions, but he had a lot longer answers. I don't have enough time to read that out to you for dramatic effect, but I think you can visually see the difference in responses. So a little bit longer response time, sometimes a little bit shorter, but much more concise answers. This is like a quick breakdown. If you guys are playing around in the back end, you can track what every turn, how much latency, where in the legs we're getting that latency. Over PSTN, it's a little bit slower, but still faster than humans. SIA, if you call our support line, is a little bit quicker than Sharon sometimes, a little bit slower sometimes. LiveKit is at about that 3 seconds that we talked about earlier, depending on what you ask it. And that's just casual conversation. I asked LiveKit, and you can go onto their main homepage and just talk to them, their main demo. I said, oh, what fun things are there to do in Chicago? And it said, LiveKit only lets you build bots. Can I tell you about that? So we're not calling any functions. This is just casual conversation. Oh, and I thought it was funny. Jarris is very quick. Michael Jarris has the lowest latency of everybody I tested. He's very quick on his feet. That is true. He has a lot of practice. But if you guys want to see these slides, just shoot me a message and I can show you my recordings, show you everything. But I only have 4 minutes to really land this plane. Oops. And talk about latency tolerance. So we're in a world, we're all engineers, we have a bunch of tools at our disposal. We can control to a certain degree the latency of our AI bot. So what number are we actually aiming for? Because I've been spewing off a lot of milliseconds. So what are we actually shooting for? And this is what I think is really, really interesting. There was a study last year on in-vehicle, like cars, voice assistants, and it had experts interacting with those assistants at different latencies while they were driving. And the optimal response time was actually 1,500 milliseconds, which was longer than I thought it was going to be. But the thing is, it's fast enough to feel responsive, but it's also slow enough where it feels thoughtful. Something I think is even more interesting than that is that same exact study showed that responses can actually be too fast. Responses under 500 milliseconds felt unnatural and give you that kind of uncanny valley vibe. And more than that, under 500 milliseconds was all over the map. Like, some people really liked it and expected it, and some people hated it. Like, the variance in opinions was huge. And that's corroborated by, we listen to segment calls, we listen to SIA calls, we get feedback from engineers, and some people want it to be as fast as it possibly can be, and some people get irritated when it starts cutting you off and starts interrupting you too much. So I was a little surprised by that, but I was like, okay, that adds up with what I've been hearing. If it's too quick, people just feel like you're not really listening. Because you're not having a conversation with the AI. In this case, the AI is completing tasks for you, which is just like what a lot of our use cases are going to look like. Things like fetching data, IVRs, performing tasks like that, opening support tickets, and things like that. So in this study, we're looking at things like navigate to Michigan Avenue or call James Bodie. These are commands, right? This isn't just casual dialogue. And like I talked about earlier, our brains have different expectations for different types of interactions. So, for example, if you ask your colleague how to work the Swiss hotel elevators, you probably are expecting them to pause and think, maybe visualize those weird buttons. If they instantaneously responded to you like Michael Jarris does, you would probably think they're not actually listening to you or processing your question, or that they're some kind of weird mechanical freak. In back and forth conversation, those pauses don't kill the flow. They actually add to your trust. This is my penultimate slide. So this is my latency tier list, and it kind of shows off the naturalness paradox of voice AI. So we've become so good at reducing latency that we can actually violate human expectations. So that same study found that anything over 5 seconds of latency was perceived as broken. So they're just going to assume your bot is broken, right? Same in human conversation. I'd assume the person kind of like maybe zoned out or disassociated for a bit. So we're definitely aiming for below this 500 millisecond ceiling. Lucky for us, that's easy to achieve. But between that and 500 milliseconds, we have a pretty big gap. So my suggestion is a framework of, if we're looking at a conversational flow, like we see people call Sigmund and ask him for dating advice for some reason. I don't know why. 500 milliseconds, 800 milliseconds might be a good target. You know, you're just chit-chatting. But if we're talking about task completion, things like, please register me for ClueCon, 1,500 milliseconds actually builds trust. It says like, oh, I'm thinking about this. I'm working on this. I actually worked, and I didn't just say I registered you, but accidentally didn't. It builds a lot of trust in our bots. For complex, multi-step operations, we're calling multiple functions, asking about the weather in Orlando, and then making reservations based on the weather. I'd say you have about up to 3 seconds, but I would suggest adding feedback along the way. A few of those I'm processing this for you, I'm working on this for you, so people don't assume your bot is broken. The lesson is, do not optimize for speed. That is almost every engineer's first instinct, including mine, because, you know, you want to make your bot impressive. But optimize for expectations of the person who's actually going to be using this. Okay, so we're going to land the plane a couple minutes late. That's okay. Lunch will still be there. So we are at an inflection point. And I believe that the future isn't just about making voice AI that waits politely for its turn. It's about creating AI that engages in messy conversations, overlapping. It's about systems that are willing to take risks. They can make educated guesses and occasionally can interrupt you just at the right moment. Latency is not just a technical detail or a number. It's actually a core part of how conversations work. Human beings keep conversations flowing by predicting, planning, and responding in parallel. And if we want AI voice systems to feel human, they need to operate within those same constraints. So that means designing for concurrency, starting output as soon as possible, and being willing to take those same calculated risks that humans do in turn-taking in conversations. A lot of systems can't achieve that simply because they're adding AI on. They're bolting it on in a panic because they see all the money coming in, the advertising dollars on AI. But when we're embedding AI directly into that media stack, like we've done here at SignalWire and a lot of you have done, building your AI bots, we are eliminating the unnecessary latency hops. We're reducing delays, and we're making real-time interaction possible at scale. So the challenge for all of you is this. Design your AI as if latency is a part of the conversation, because it is. Thank you.